Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. I am Allysia, your host, and today we are going to talk all about dynamics. It's been brought to my attention that I haven't had a dedicated video about dynamics, so I figured that today's the day. We're going to live it up, we're going to talk about dynamics, and it'll be fun, I hope. What we're going to do in today's video is talk about what dynamics are, the basics, so even if you're just starting out, you'll be able to follow this video. I want to talk about dynamics across different musical eras because the way you play dynamics changes depending if you're playing a Baroque piece or a modern piece, so we're going to touch on that. And then I'm going to give you some tips for being able to play dynamics effectively. Now, as far as I know, there's no implement this special tip and then 5 minutes later you have great dynamics forever. I haven't come across anything like that. If you have an insider tip that is gonna be amazing like that, just please let me and everyone else know. That would be great. So this video isn't gonna be instantly become amazing in dynamics, but I'm hoping that it'll give you some ideas of things that you can do in your practice to slowly, over the course of time, improve your ability to play dynamics. Anyway, let's get started. I really wanted to share this question that Virgil asked about dynamics since it's the basis of the entire video and likely something many of you guys can relate to, including myself. So here it is. I'm an adult beginner who just started of March this year. Wow, that's pretty recent. And so this would have been in 2018 still, but I digress. And currently my piano teacher is gearing me towards ABRSM grade 3. As per subject, I'm currently having a little hiccup with dynamics as I tend to either play too hard, too soft, and I frequently receive comments from my teacher about abrupt crescendos. I'm still developing my dynamic ear since I'm new to the piano, so I come to your YouTube channel to find some pointers and tips to get some enlightenment, but alas, none could be found. Or maybe I missed it. No, I don't actually think, except for little bits and pieces and videos here and there, I haven't done a dedicated video. So anyway, that's what this is, a video focused around dynamics and how to practice dynamics. Before we get into the how of playing dynamics, let's talk about the what. What are dynamics? Well, dynamics are just symbols that represent volume. We have symbols like P, which stands for piano, that tells us to play quietly. We have these V-shaped lines telling us to get louder and to get quieter. Those are crescendos and decrescendos, and etc. What you see here on the screen are the basic dynamic markings you're going to be running into. Basically everything all the way from really, really soft to really, really loud. Although pianissimo and fortissimo are pretty uncommon. You won't come across them very much. If you're playing piano music that has a P over here and then later on it has an F, so quiet and loud, that's going to be indicating that you want to do an abrupt change. You're basically going from quiet to loud with little to no transition. Now, if you're playing a piece of music that has, say, a P followed by a crescendo and then maybe finished with a forte or a mezzo forte or something like that, it's telling you that you're going to go from quiet to loud gradually, note by note. Sometimes crescendos and diminuendos last for just a measure. Sometimes they last for many measures. But the idea is the same. You want to gradually change your volume. So that's the what of dynamics. And before we talk tips and techniques and stuff like that, I want to talk about the different eras and how you'll apply dynamics in say Bach and Baroque music versus Chopin and Romantic music and so on. In the Baroque period, between about 1600 and 1750, pianos as we know them today didn't exist. When people wrote and played keyboard music, it was usually on a harpsichord or clavichord, and organs were another popular keyboard as well. The harpsichord and clavichord just didn't have much capacity for dynamic expression, which is why dynamics written for Baroque music is so different. In Baroque music, you'll see terraced dynamics, which just means abrupt dynamic changes. You'll go from piano to mezzo piano with little transition, or you'll have even more dramatic changes like piano to forte. These sudden changes in volume were what keyboard instruments were capable of doing back in the day. They weren't really able to do anything more subtle. And this is important to keep in mind when you're playing music from this time period. In the classical period, between about 1750 and 1825, pianos were being built, developed, and fine-tuned. So composers at the beginning of the classical era, such as Haydn, would write a lot of keyboard sonatas for harpsichord, say. But towards the end of the era, classical composers such as Beethoven would write sonatas on a more modern sounding piano. The damper pedals on these early pianos were very different, but dynamically they became more similar to pianos of today. So that's why you'll see much more extreme dynamic ranges in classical piano sonatas. So Beethoven especially, for example, was fond of fortissimo or fortissimo. In the Romantic period, from about 1825 to 1900, pianos became the thing that we know and love today. They went through a huge development. Things like the damper pedal improved, the volume and expressive quality of them improved, and this is the era where you really saw piano superstars begin to pop up, such as Liszt and Alkin. In this era, composers really started adding dynamic detail to their music. You'll see plenty of accents, sforzandos, and other touch markings with a wide range of dynamic contrasts and plenty of crescendos and diminuendos. There also tends to be more detail with pedal markings, since this is when the piano had developed a modern style damper pedal. In the modern era, which is basically from 1900 to now-ish, dynamic markings are as variable as the era itself. You have early 20th century composers like Bartók who wrote these hyper-specific dynamics and articulations, basically leaving no note behind. And other similar composers would be guys like Kabalevsky, Shostakovich, etc. You had composers such as Debussy who insist on subtlety in their music, which is very, very different from the drama of the Romantic era. And then the kind of obscure sounding modernism era, and then like you have jazz, pop, blues, all of those styles beyond that. It's good to have a grip on which dynamic styles were common in which eras, just so you interpret them effectively, because nothing's worse than a romantic sounding interpretation of Clair de Lune. Clair de Lune was an Impressionist era piece, and you really just have to light touches is so crucial in that piece. But I can't tell you how many times I've heard piano students play it with the sweeping Liszt style grand gestures, just totally not appropriate for that style of music. When it comes down to it, playing dynamics on the piano is really just a matter of how quickly and firmly you press down a key. Quicker and firmer means a louder note, whereas slower and softer equals a quieter note. One thing that I've noticed over the years of teaching is that people tend to lean in one direction volumely. That's not a word. People tend to lean in one direction on the volume spectrum. So some people have a tendency to be quiet players just naturally, and some people have a tendency to be heavy-handed. And that's the camp that I fall into. And it's good to have an idea of where on the spectrum you fall, because then you can work on your weakness. So since I tend to be a very clangy, heavy-handed player, I'm really into the fortes, but I'm not so good at the pianos, then that gives me a sense that that's where I need to spend more time. I need to focus on finding nuance in the quieter volumes. So here's one of the biggest tips I can give you about playing dynamics on the piano. This is a physical tip, and it's just as abstracted as it is tangible. You really just have to feel it to understand what I'm saying. Project dynamics with your arms and not just your fingers. If you use only your fingers to create the force or softness, the tone will always be a little thin. So for example, your fortes with just finger strength will sound a little harsh, and your pianos will sound a little weightless and empty. Now, I encourage you to experiment with this on your own, because you should be able to feel and hear the difference once you start playing around with it. See if you can notice it. But if you start playing with more weight from your arms as opposed to just your finger, you get a more robust dynamic tone. So your fortes will sound warm and open, and your pianos won't just disappear into thin air. It's really one of those things. You just need to sit down and play around with it so you can start feeling it out. Much of playing dynamics comes from experience and feedback. So if you're relatively new to the piano still, don't worry about it too much, because it does take quite a while to really train your ear and to train your body. For the first few years when I teach people piano, we tend to just focus on creating contrast. So we won't really focus on nuance so much as being able to play a forte, being able to play a piano, and maybe we'll do some of the ones in between. But it's more about, just learning the bright, big, abrupt contrasts to start. One thing that I would recommend doing, even if you're just starting out, is record yourself playing regularly. And this is a useful thing to do for a lot of reasons. So specifically for dynamics, it'll help train your ear. And it's interesting how when we play, we can't hear Well, I can't hear like the harshness in my playing so much when I'm actually playing it, but when I sit back and listen to a recording, I can tell like, okay, that forte was really harsh. Or maybe again, if you're the opposite, you tend to be a quiet player. You're like, ooh, that like barely came through. That was like a insubstantial wisp of air. So spend time developing a great forte first and a great piano first before starting to worry too much about the nuances. And again, this can take quite a long time. And you can practice these dynamics in your pieces, but you can also practice them with your technical exercises too. And that can actually be a way to liven up a scale. If you're used to playing your scales just like whatever default volume that you play at, it could be a good experience to experiment playing them quietly or to play them loudly or whatever. And that might bring some life into your technical exercises too. So you know how when you go to live theater and you're sitting in the audience, the actors on the stage like look pretty normal, but then when you see them up close, you're like, wow, they got a lot of makeup on. It's this idea of over dramatizing that carries over to the piano and other creative forms of expression as well. One thing that I find really interesting is if you're just like sitting at the piano by yourself playing, you might play and be like, oh yeah, that was a great crescendo. But if you were listening to it as an audience member or just listening to a recording, you might realize like, oh, that barely came through at all. Oftentimes in our head, what we think is enough doesn't necessarily project outside of like our own head. And we often have to be more over dramatic than we think is necessary for it to sound the appropriate level of dramatic. Does that make sense? And again, this is something that you can improve and work on by recording yourself play. Just such a useful thing to do. It's kind of a pain, I get it, but it's so useful. I encourage you to exaggerate your dynamics, which has two benefits. The first one being that your dynamics become more noticeable and apparent, which is what we've already been talking about. And doing so gets you more comfortable playing with a wider dynamic range. Being comfortable with a wider dynamic range will help you eventually learn how to do subtlety. I truly believe you can't learn how to be subtle with something until you learn how to be really dramatic with it. It's like you have to start out here in order to figure out how to like, I don't know, get it in here. I don't know if this is making any sense with my wild gestures. And that's why I don't recommend learning music by guys like Debussy until, like, because Debussy is all about subtlety. So learning his music before you're a mature enough piano player to do so just usually ends up in a less ideal scenario, like I've talked about in the past, like interpreting Debussy's music in a romantic way or just not being able to like properly convey that. Another thing that'll help your dynamic playing is to really map out your dynamics across an entire piece. So for example, say that you're learning Liszt's Liebestraum number 3. There are 6 pages in this piece, and the crux or climax of the piece is on page 4, which is what you can see on the screen right now. Now, it's worth getting a sense of where the climactic moment of your piece is and then work around that. So if page 4 requires my weightiest, most dramatic fortissimo, then I need to make sure that I don't waste my loudest playing, my best fortissimo playing before this point. It means any fortissimo I come across before page 4 can't be as loud. This is really important. Otherwise, this moment won't have as much drama and oomph as it needs to tell the story effectively. Even when you're learning a piece like Clair de Lune, which barely goes above a mezzo piano in its entire duration, you still have to kind of go through the same dynamic plan. If mezzo piano is like the highest volume, where does that occur? Does that occur with where the climactic moment in the piece is, which usually the loudest part of a piece is going to be the climactic moment. So you still want to go through it and map it out and figure out where the peaks are. And then one thing too is if your dynamic range in a piece is limited. So say the quietest range is pianissimo and your loudest range is mezzo piano, that's not a very wide range. So you have to think about how you're going to be able to differentiate a piano from a pianissimo from a mezzo piano, and that could be a little bit more of a challenge to do. So one thing you could consider is maybe you make the mezzo piano a little louder than you would otherwise in a different piece. Not so much that you would end up making the whole thing sound romantic, but maybe just a little bit. If you have a dynamic plan for your piece, that should be able to then make your dynamics in general more effective. One point that I always try to get across to my students, and one that they're really likely to ignore, is the idea that you want to integrate dynamics right from the start of learning a piece. And I know that sounds crazy, because when you're first learning a piece, there's all the notes you have to figure out, there's all the rhythms you have to figure out, there's just like an overwhelming amount of detail all at once. But If you integrate dynamics in the beginning, which seems difficult but is doable, you're building that dynamic in to the way you practice so that it just ends up feeling more natural and more organic than it would if you added it over top of it. It's kind of like how a stew tastes better the second day because all the spices have had a day to like sit and meld together. Going down the cooking comparison rabbit hole again, I see. But the dynamics end up integrating that way and sounding more natural. And you also shouldn't have to spend a lot of time like memorizing dynamics later on, because if you just always been playing a certain passage at a certain volume, it'll just be instinctual. This also helps you avoid mechanical playing. So if you're focused on creating a beautiful sound and playing dynamics as a part of that right from the get-go, then that's going to safeguard you from having robotic performances when you're not focused on expression or dynamics of any kind and you're literally just learning the notes and the rhythms. There's a tendency to just like compartmentalize and play in a way that sounds mechanical. So again, that's just another idea. All right, so here's a quick summary of the most important steps on playing dynamics on the piano. Understand the era you're playing so that your dynamic choices are appropriate. Use arm weight to create great dynamics as opposed to just finger weight. Record yourself frequently so you can evaluate if your fortes are harsh or if your pianos are flimsy. You want to practice developing a really, really good forte and piano before getting into anything more subtle. Play your dynamics more dramatically than you think will sound good, especially when you're starting out. You can always scale back a little bit later once you're more fluent in dynamics. Create a dynamic plan for the piece you're learning, so find the climactic moments and work around it. And finally, don't put off adding dynamics to a piece. Add them right from the beginning, even if you think that I'm crazy for suggesting that. And that's all for today's video. I hope you found this discussion at least somewhat helpful. Like I said, I don't have like a step-by-step 5 minutes to perfect dynamics forever plan. Again, if such a plan exists, please let me know. I really want to read it. But hopefully this gave you something to chew on, something to think about, and maybe some new things to try in your practice. Even if that thing is playing dynamics right from the beginning of learning a piece. That's your takeaway, okay? Okay, try that. Anyway, thanks so much for watching today's video. I will catch you in the next one. Thanks, guys. And other similar composers would be like Dmitri, and other similar, but maybe just a little bit.